What's up, folks? This is Justin Garcia, aka Master Chim. Forgot my name there for a second. And on the line, the video via Zoom, I have friend of the Pressure Project and a gentleman whom I respect and I feel has a very interesting story that I wanted to bring you guys, Mr. Nick Dean. Nick, why don't you say what's up to the Pressure Project listeners?
What's going on, guys? Honored to be here.
Great. I'm glad to finally get you on. So you have a very interesting story, and I could try and, concoct an introduction to it, but I will spoil too much of it. But you've been in the news recently, and you've acquired some notoriety, and I want to go through the story, and if you don't mind, let's start from the beginning. What started this whole adventure that you find yourself in?
Man, I guess I suppose the first thing I remember my grandfather telling me when I was young is that he was 12 years old before he knew that damn Yankee was two words. And so he worked in the oil field, but he was a historian, and he made these little miniature projects in this garage. Then they're on display at the local museum in Borger, Texas, actually, the Hutchins County Museum. And he recreated historical sites where there were Indian battles, local houses, and he was a historian through and through. And so I grew up with an admiration of history and particularly like Southern history and Texas history. And then from there, I grew up, and then it was time to graduate high school, and my dad said, basically, you got to go. And he drove me to the military recruiter and said, pick one, I don't care. He's like, you're probably not tough enough for the Marine Corps. Your grandpa was in the Air Force. And I really didn't want to go, so I kind of just walked up and I joined the Air Force. And from there, my goal in joining the Air Force was to see the world, and that's what I did. And when I was I worked in signals intelligence, and I learned Morse code and did some stuff like that. And I went to Japan, and the barrack was next to the library, and I just spent from then on, just getting in, just trying to learn. I realized when I was 19 years old that I didn't really know how to read. And I walked up and I picked up a book on philosophy, because smart people read philosophy, and I just couldn't understand any of it. And essentially that's when my education kind of began. But I traveled all over Asia to Cambodia, Thailand, China, Australia, and then all over Japan. And then I left there and went through South America for about 45 days, backpacking through the Andes to Machu Picchu in Bolivia. And while I was in these places, I would read about stuff that went on. So when I went to the killing fields, I was reading a book on the killing fields. I learned about the communist revolution and Che Guevara as I was traveling through Bolivia. And then I went to Washington, D.C. and felt like just kind of an outcast or stranger, because it was this massive city. And I'd always lived in small town Texas. And I got to Washington, D.C. and from there just kind of, I don't know, just kind of stuck to myself, and then traveled to Europe a couple times, and then got out of the military. I didn't really have a great time in the military. I was kind of getting in trouble here and there for having an authority problem. I was at NSA when 9/11 happened, and then shortly after I got out of the military, I got into archaeology, anthropology. So I finished my degree and worked in doing a lot of field work. So literally did hundreds of digs in and around Washington, D.C. and the Mid-Atlantic region, and just continued learning about everything, traveling around the country, going to small historical societies, and kind of just having fun trying to learn. And then I took a trip to the Middle East and spent about a month walking around Turkey and Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, and just traveling around there. And that was kind of when I first got introduced to Islam. And at the time I was following Christianity, because it was just what I grew up in. And so I wanted to figure out how to unify Judaism, Christianity, Islam, which fools have probably been trying to do for centuries, but it was my turn to try it. And so I worked in archaeology for some years, and then I had an opportunity to go to India doing humanitarian work, like as a photographer and logistics coordinator. So I traveled all over India, and like while I was there, I was up in the Himalayas and just happened to be in a place where the Dalai Lama was. So I got to sit in a room and, drink tea and listen to the Dalai Lama give lectures on Korean Buddhism. And so my life's kind of been one just chasing of adventure after the next. And And when I was in India, I was working in some of these schools, and I knew I wasn't part of the Indian culture, and I never would be as an outsider. So I decided when I would go back to America, I wanted to work in schools, like maybe be a history teacher or just work with people in my society. And so that's what I did. I went back and started working for this company, and was kind of an entry-level counselor. And from there, it just quickly just grew and increased. So I became a substitute teacher, and then an English teacher, and then I was put into a vice principal position at a kind of a maximum security juvenile correction program. Was there for a couple of years, went to Baltimore City for a couple of years, and then to New Orleans about 3 years ago as principal of the expulsion school here. And I had a lot of success along the way, working with good people, and then just trying to understand, like apply anthropology and what I understood about, like, multicultural globalism to those paradigms, to kids that were the outcasts. Because in some ways I kind of felt like an outcast as well. And I've always been attracted to people on the fringes. So it was just natural. And I got down here and worked really hard in this expulsion school, and because it was not a good place necessarily when me and my team took over, and a lot of fights, a lot of violence. It was in the public. I absolutely put it more in the public eye, but it was a really rough place, and I just went in with a mission and an identity, and I'd like to talk about that a little while. But having that identity on what the identity of the school was, and then to stick with that. And the expulsion rate dropped 87% in the first year. The out-of-school suspension rate dropped 50% the first year, 53% the next year. And because we just my mindset was like, we just need to keep kids in school, because they had the option to leave. They could quit and leave if they wanted to.
What is an expulsion school?
If students that get expelled from other schools, it's an alternative school. So, if a kid goes to school A, gets in trouble, they kick them out, they put them in an alternative school. So all the expulsion students come to one school, which is kind of a ridiculous model to begin with, but I didn't create that. I just took over leadership of it. And then, I had a great time with it. And I mean, there was always some kind of blowback to me being white and everybody else being, the students, 100% black population, majority black staff. My first day on the job when I got here, I went to meet the curriculum and instruction coordinator, African-American woman. And I knew by looking at the organizational chart that I needed to pair up with a couple people in order to get this thing right. Can't do it alone. And I introduced myself to her, and she turned around and said, it makes sense that they'd send a white man down here. You fit the model. And then, she quit within a month, and a couple other people quit within a month, because there was a real resistance to having a white man at the school. For some people, not for all of them. Like some of them, as everywhere, you got people that get it and people that don't. And so we worked at it really hard for 3 years, got a charter renewal, got an extension, got all kinds of accolades in the press. And then the mayor decides to start taking down Confederate monuments in the area, and there's been a national push to remove some of these things. And I thought it was stupid all the time. I was never okay with it, but I wasn't necessarily public about that. And what happened was on May 1st, May Day, some guys went out, some men and women went and just basically stood at the Jefferson Davis Monument, and they got attacked by the local Antifa, and they were accompanied with the deputy mayor. And these people, they started getting attacked with bottles, and this lady got stabbed. There's an Indian man down there named KK, and he did 2 tours in Iraq, 1 tour in Afghanistan. It's just like a soldier through and through, but he recognizes the bigger attacks on the American system. His wife got stabbed, a lady in a wheelchair got maced, and so they kind of put out a call. They said, "Hey, come help us out." And the following week was another big demonstration down at the Lee Monument, organized by a group called Take 'Em Down NOLA. And I just recognized online that people from all over the country were coming in. People from California were coming in, from Tennessee, Arkansas, all over. And so I kind of started coordinating with them, just to as a logistics point of view. And I'd never intended to take a place in it. And even today, man, the only thing I did was get my picture taken and put in the paper. I didn't do anything really, but I went down there, and on May 7th, and the police stood up. I mean, everybody was divided. There was virtually no violence, and it was a kind of a benign yelling match. And then it was over, and then then a couple weeks later, it was the day that the Lee Monument, which is on this massive pedestal, was getting taken down. I went there in the middle of the night because the other ones had been removed at night. And while I was down there, there was a guy that I knew that just took my picture near a Confederate flag. And then he sent it to his buddies, and they put together a massive social media campaign here. White supremacist, hate monger, representing white supremacy, get him out of our city, essentially. And that was it. After that, I was kind of toast. A couple days later, somebody had found some clip of where I talked to this guy from the American Freedom Keepers. I didn't even know who many of these organizations were until then. Like, I'd never heard of the League of the South. I'd never heard of a lot of these groups. Now I know who they are, and now I'm connecting with all of them in kind of a bigger way. And so they put together, and he put together a screenshot, said school principal wearing Nazi rings, Nazi SS rings, white supremacist. And then he sent that to every news agency around the country, and it blew up, and I was terminated a few days later with no cause given.
Now, what were on a little side note, what were the rings and stuff, the symbols that you had on?
Oh, sure. They're in my car. I'll show you. One is the Day of the Dead, Mexican Day of the Dead skull. They call it sugar skull, those ornamental skulls. Like, they make cakes. One was that, and the other one was a Maltese cross or an iron cross.
Right.
No swastikas on them. They were just and I wore them. The reason I wore them was just if I had to punch somebody, I was going to hurt them.
Right.
Honestly, what it was. They're like just biker rings.
Right. So, everybody knows the Mexican Day of the Dead is a big symbol for the white supremacists.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So now, before we get into the because I want to dig a little bit deeper into the way the events transpired, let's take a side note and just establish why you were against them pulling those statues down. So you're not from New Orleans. But you also have an extensive background in being exposed to different cultures around the world, having experience with archaeology and anthropology. You have an educated process by which you've come to your conclusion. I think the process's validity is established, but how exactly did you come to the conclusion that this is not something you could support?
Because I think the American landscape is stronger when we have markers in time. And to me, it's very Orwellian. It's very revisionist, and it just it doesn't sit like the right thing to do. I don't think there's strength in removing that. Most people that lived here said they saw those things for years and never thought much about them. My position was then, and is just that instead of removing markers from 120 years ago, build new markers for where we are in our time. So build and add to the landscape. I just think we're treading dangerous ground because I don't know where it stops. I think if Robert E. Lee is a symbol of white supremacy, and if General Beauregard, who some say was a Creole, which is kind of a mix, and he ran for mayor of New Orleans on kind of a civil rights type platform and lost. So when I think a lot of people advocating for the removal of these things are not aware of the longitudinal history of it. And it's just very dangerous to, it's emotional. It's highly emotional. Right. And making highly emotional decisions, you don't win like that. Whereas we could leave those and then build more and add for this time in history.
Right.
And never mind just the division and chaos. And I think once the toll came in, it was 2.2 million that the city has spent on this so far, which is just for a city that's as economically deprived as this one, then it doesn't seem like a good use of funds.
Right. So you are now at that, when this happens, you are the principal of a next to 100% black school, expulsion school, and you have made tremendous progress in that school, correct?
Yes, yes. We have.
Let's talk a little bit about that. From the time you got there to the time you left, what were some of the metrics that you could tell us about your progress and what you've done?
The metrics would be in terms of discipline at the school. So the previous year, I think there had been like 76 expulsions from that school, which essentially meant if a student got expelled from the school, they would just have more time added on to theirs. So Like they would have to come to our school for a certain amount of time, and then at the end of that time, they could choose to go to another school. One metric of success would be last December, 77 students were eligible to leave the school, and only 4 did. So I had the one metric would be the amount of students that stayed. Huge. We had 100% graduation rate the last 3 years. We have been audited by the state and federal government on many occasions, and didn't receive so much as an immediate action. So all of our audits were passes. Our culturally, I reached out to all kinds of groups because I'm in my mind, bring the community in. You know, we only benefit by creating more alliances. And so we created a lot of alliances, a lot of support for people coming in, say, you know, like the Federal Bar Association teaching constitutional law to the social studies groups, taking them back to meet the U.S. attorney and to talk about law. Art groups coming in. There was just a lot of different things had gone on as far as the community resource wise. We would write letters for students that were in the justice system. You know, anywhere between half and 70% of our students were involved in some level, whether it's probate, some level of the justice system. Some students would go to jail and they'd get out and they'd come to us. And my position on that was, if the student's going to work, we're going to work as hard as the student does. So if a student's coming in, if they're working, if they're towing the line, if they're demonstrating that effort, then it's our responsibility to represent them in this bureaucratic mess that there is. So we would do that quite a bit. You know, in January of this year, 6% of our student population had been shot. And it just, so there's a massive amount of violence. And the biggest problems that we would have there would really be kids would come out, and it's a calm setting, and a lot of them, they would kind of drop their guard and be goofy, you know, be like regular kid type stuff.
Right.
So in working with the staff, I was saying, recognize the difference between like normal kid behaviors and then like delinquent behaviors, because they're different, you know. So just because you're asking a boy to sit in a desk for 8 hours a day is kind of ridiculous, you know. So how do we break that up? How do we get kids to work on site or get the exercise in, and further challenge them in the levels of somehow how our people in our circle speak about masculinity and femininity and family. And so those are the positions I just kind of tried to drive.
Right.
And you gave the one of the most influential things I had heard, and I'd already been doing this, but it's when you gave a State of the Jungle on leadership. And it couldn't have been more perfect. And I'd always somewhat understood it, but you framed it in a way of saying, like, it's important to let your team know, do not follow me as a person. Like, don't, because I'm going to change. And that's, my whole life has been changed. So what is our identity? And in my school, the identity was structure and collaboration and ownership. And those are the things, along with the mission statement that says, you know, this is what the mission statement is. We're going to provide standards-based, safe learning environment. And this is the identity of our school. And for me, it was just ruthlessly staying on with that identity. And so my transition out of there, for me, is somewhat peaceful, because I was constantly speaking in a term of, I will not be here one day. I will not be here. This is where we are now. This is the identity. And so, and I'm the leader as long as I can be. You know, I'll represent this identity as long as I can. And so I tried to apply that, you know, not necessarily from a brotherhood type tribe to, you know, like a place where people are being paid to come and work. And right. I think it was really successful.
That's awesome. So now, the progress that you've made in that school, the media campaign is now, has blown up. Your name's out there. You got doxxed, and there's this conflict. Or I'm assuming there's this conflict between all of these people who you've established yourself as being a tribal brother to, and all this information that's being pushed by a third party about you being, you know, this Nazi super ninja or some shit. What exactly, like, how did that unfold? You know, with the connections you've already had, you have a reputation already in this crew. This information comes out. How is there a transition internally with the people you've been spending all this time with?
No, well, it wasn't good because it happened in 2 stages. And the first stage was the group that took a picture of me at the Confederate flag at Robert E. Lee, and they passed that around, and that was on several local news stories. When that happened, a couple people, that was the beginning of it. So I think the relationship, kind of the breakup of it is not good, because when that came out, people were kind of questioning, like, wait a minute, that didn't match up with how they understood me. And there was a lot of people that stood up for me in the very beginning. Like when those two things happened, they said, no, I know this guy. I know what's going on. You guys got it wrong. I told them that I wasn't there to protest, which is the truth, because I was there to watch the monument come down. The protest had already happened. And so that was that. And then 2 days later is when the journalist put the picture and put out the Nazi rings and all that. And I was just done after that. So these people that had stood up for me, I don't know what they could do, because after that it became a national media. And I consider most of those networks, I'd say 3/4 of that is just broken and hadn't
Right.
heard. So that's effectively been destroyed.
Right.
But I know that deep down they know something's up. They know it doesn't add up. I had one person reach out to me who is your quintessential social justice warrior. And there's a handful of these that I work with that I respect, and I I appreciate the dialogue. And she sent me a message and she said, I can't believe this. Like, this is an absolute witch hunt. I never thought the left was like this. People on the right have always said that we're doing a witch hunt, but I didn't believe them. And she goes, but I see it unfolding. She's like, I hope this isn't what we become. So
Right.
I had to for that.
So now this whole thing happened. You are not in the school system anymore. Where do you plan on going from here?
I'm not sure.
Professionally,
Professionally, I don't even want to say, because I'm afraid these assholes will follow me around and try to do something. I've got I have to become, and I knew I had to become anyways, just independent. So actually, the Indian guy KK I went down there and hung out with him the other day at one of those monuments, and he said, what you have to look at it is, like, think about the immigrants that came to this country that weren't aligned in the regular system. So they had to come here and they had to form their own communities outside of the mainstream. He's like, he goes, you're an immigrant in this society now. You have to rebuild outside of that structure. So I put together a website called ethnoroots.com to do genealogy work. I have some subscriptions to genealogy work. So I'm do some side things there. It turns out there's a big demand in China for online teaching. So I have an online teaching job with students in China, because if these guys don't want me to teach our own kids, then there's a billion people over there that do. So, but I'm working to become independent on that, and to be actively engaged in kind of a vocal resistance. It may be a lost cause, I don't know, but since I've been kind of doxxed in this way, and a lot of people have said to me, like, thank you for at least standing up or saying what we can, because there's so much social and fear underneath where people are just afraid to speak out because these church ladies are so loud.
Right.
Dangerous.
Yeah, I think that is probably my biggest frustration. I grew up in the Bronx in a very, urban, rough, environment. And as I progressed, and I've been locked up as a teenager, I've had, my share of experiences, but there was a point in my life where I started giving credence to those formulas that were working, and I stopped sort of working against myself. And I had to open my idea. I mean, being that I wasn't where I wanted to be, I had to consider the notion that, well, maybe I'm getting some of these things wrong, and if I'm going to change my outcome, I'm probably going to wind up changing my approach. And when I got to that point, I started acknowledging those formulas that worked. So what's frustrating about your story to me is, you were a formula that was applied to that school and it worked. And that they would sacrifice any of that progress for what is basically an unfounded, just like you said, emotional reaction. It speaks to why not only the left is becoming increasingly more dangerous, but also why we have these perennial cycles of failure in these types of environments. Because when something starts to work, it doesn't take much for it to be rejected for completely irrelevant, disconnected reasons. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And and further, I got tipped off to some, like my plan was to kind of transition because it was an increasingly a hostile situation, what I would say hostile, and that my supervisor, who is the superintendent of the school, was said to me when we went to a conference last November, and she went to some workshop on race, and she came into the lunch afterwards, and she said, this conference was just so amazing, and it was so powerful, and now I can see how Anglo-Saxons look at us. And I was like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And she goes, well, when a person of color walks into a room, an Anglo-Saxon looks at them as if they're less. And that's why they say, oh, that person of color speaks well, or, oh, look how well dressed they are. And I said, so you're telling me that an Anglo-Saxon automatically looks down or thinks less of people of color or any other ethnicity? She goes, yes, it's inherent, it's part of the system. And I said, well, what does an Anglo-Saxon look like? And she said, you. And so that was very telling. And then in Washington, D.C., and I'm like, all right. And there had already been several other things, all right? And then it was in Washington, D.C., and I took a group of people down because I lived in D.C. for about 10 years. And I took them down to the monuments. I know the layout of the city, and I could give them a good tour. And I was down there with two other principals. One of them was at one of the schools in Colorado. One was one of the ones in California. And when we were down there, one of the guys was like, this is all the oppressor. Like, I can't wait until white people are a minority in this country. All of this is stolen. All of these people are slave owners and oppressors, and I can't wait till all this comes down. And I'm like, holy man. And I'm having the logical conversation with, like, well, I mean, they were, do you understand how the world kind of works? And like, this isn't unique in the history of the world, and people go in and they take land, and that's how it was. And that further, also, this American experiment is what has given the most freedom and the most liberty to the most amount of people. And so to hear essentially the superintendent tell me that I automatically think less of people because I'm an Anglo-Saxon, and to hear two other principals, one was a Mexican, one was claimed Native American, and all three of them on that trip told me how much they were basically kind of against me. So it's part of the bigger culture and climate of this country, and we've seen the direction it's going, and specifically with that, and that the things that they say and do are exactly what they think we think, I suppose. But
Right.
as you know, I mean, we've seen it. But when that happened in November, when she said then I knew it was time to start packing up.
Right.
And I just didn't make it, So, or I made it and just kind of just blew up, and now, like I was honored to make the Berkeley Antifa page. So I think I might take some of this and just run with it and scream and yell and kick and rabble rouse and just try to just fight back as hard as I can, even if it is a lost cause. I don't know what else at this point to do as far as that goes.
Well, I talking to my sons, the notion of getting to Valhalla for fighting and dying in battle, I use it as a sort of reference on what one's effort actually means, and how a lot of times the lost causes, it's irrelevant. It's the effort that we put in and the spirit of the fight, while we're in it. And it's, I point out to them, it's the guys the warriors that fight most valiantly and die on the battlefield, that the gods, want to bring to Valhalla. So I think it's very representative of my approach to these types of struggles. And, we have a very limited amount of influence over the universe, but we have a very maximal amount of influence over ourselves. And, when I hear people's stories like your own, it's a testament to those virtues that I think we need to get back to in our society. I help in my school here, it's predominantly, minority. But, I know full well that all the work that I do and all the help that I give these young people, young men, young women, and even adults in this environment here, I know I wouldn't last a month in the New York City Board of Ed, because of, all of the constraints that are there. So I would expect somebody like you to be too good for those systems, and too valuable for those systems. They're not going to give you the value you deserve. And I think it's a good thing in the long run, because it'll allow you to find the place where you need to be, and where you could be most effective. and I look forward, to you doing that. So we're going to wrap up. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the talk. I'm very much interested in looking to see where you wind up, how the situation, concludes, with that in the school and such. But you have friends here. You have friends at the Pressure Project. You have friends, all over the country that support you. You know that. But any final words for the listeners of the Pressure Project?
I think if you're listening, you're already in the right spot. So I mean, the thing that like fear is that thing, and it's very real, and so then there are real world consequences. But I don't know if we're gonna win this thing. We just have to just keep every single day just waking up, looking at that identity, and then trying to live it. So I mean, I don't know. I've learned a lot from you guys. The work that the guys in Virginia have done. So I'm kind of looking up to you guys at the same time. So no, just keep at it. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Right. Well, I appreciate it. And if there's any listeners in China, look up Nick Dean.
No.
All right, brother, man. I appreciate it. And I will talk to you soon. Need anything, you just give me a holler.
All right, man. Thank you. Cool.